Our fiscal situation is a 350-pound, two-pack-a-day smoker on the ICU table. I know, that is a wildly visceral, intense medical metaphor, but it perfectly hits the nail on the head when we're talking about the high stakes of today's explainer. When economists and experts talk about the United States federal budget, they aren't just, staring at dry spreadsheets. They are diagnosing a patient who is on an incredibly dangerous, totally unsustainable path. The plaque is literally building up in the system right now. So today, we're going to look straight at the data to see exactly what happens if this patient doesn't change their habits. Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a massive, complex issue, America's debt spiral and its absolute breaking point. To put things in perspective, right now, America's borrowing levels are the exact same size as the entire U.S. economy. Think about that for a second. We are spending way, way more than we bring in, and we're just borrowing to cover the difference. Experts actually like to compare this to an invisible dog fence. You really don't want to hit it, but the terrifying part is you won't know exactly where that limit is until you get zapped. And right now, we seem incredibly intent on finding that exact tipping point.
Here is our roadmap for today. 1. The debt tipping point. 2. Market fallout. 3. Economic ripples. 4. Global impact. And finally, number 5, the real threat.
All right, let's jump right into Section 1, the debt tipping point, hitting that invisible dog fence. Believe it or not, for a lot of its history, the U.S. actually tried to balance its checkbook. Back in the late 1990s, the Clinton administration made some seriously tough political choices, and it actually resulted in a budget surplus. But then the 21st century hit us with compounding crises. The 2000s brought expensive wars and sweeping tax cuts. Then we had the 2008 financial crisis, and then, of course, the 2020 global pandemic. Add all that up, and borrowing just completely skyrocketed. So how did we dig a hole this deep? Well, Kent Smetter's team over at Wharton modeled this out, and it's actually pretty cleanly divided into thirds. About 1/3 comes from tax cuts, 1/3 from spending increases, and the final third from national emergencies. Now, obviously, borrowing for a crisis makes total sense, but the deliberate tax cuts and the ongoing spending increases, those are what pushed us onto this totally unsustainable track. In fact, Smetter's Wharton model warns that under current law, there's so much debt piling up that the fixed income and bond markets could actually collapse within 20 years.
Now, usually when a borrower can't make their payments, they default. Game over. But for the United States, a literal default is highly, highly unlikely. Why? Well, because the U.S. government has a magic trick that you and I definitely don't have. They can literally just print more money to pay the bills. Problem solved, right? Actually, scratch that. Avoiding default through the printing press creates a completely different, massive problem. Let's trace how that actually plays out. Step 1, the government cranks up the printing press to pay down its mountain of debt. Step 2, millions of brand new dollars flood into the economy, but they're chasing the exact same amount of goods and services. So, Step 3, the inevitable result is aggressive, widespread inflation. Legendary investor Ray Dalio actually compares this to a severe disease in a patient's circulatory system. When the supply of debt being pumped out is vastly greater than the demand to buy it, your whole economy gets incredibly sick.
Which brings us to Section 2, market fallout. Enter the bond vigilantes.
So who are these bond vigilantes? Basically, when the government issues debt, it sells treasuries. If investors start to feel like the government is acting reckless and risking inflation, they demand a much higher interest rate just to buy those treasuries. One expert beautifully described fixed income markets as the Mike Tyson of economics. Think about it. Politicians in Washington might draft up some big, beautiful plan to spend money, but the bond market is Mike Tyson. They will just punch you right in the face. They do not bend to political pressure, they break things.
Ed Yardeni actually coined this fantastic phrase way back in 1983. He realized that if the government wasn't going to act responsibly to keep inflation in check, these massive investors would just act as the sheriffs and force their hand by jacking up borrowing costs. But here is the truly terrifying part. When Yardeni coined this term in the early 80s, the national deficit was about $200 billion. Today, it is 10 times that amount. That means these vigilantes hold more leverage over the U.S. government right now than at any point in history.
If you want to see exactly what a bond vigilante attack looks like in the real world, just look at the UK's recent cautionary tale. Back in the fall of 2022, UK Prime Minister Liz Truss unveiled this really bold plan to cut taxes by £45 billion. The markets took one look at the underlying math, lost absolute confidence and revolted immediately. The British pound totally collapsed, investors furiously dumped UK bonds, and pension funds were sent scrambling. It created such a massive, chaotic downward spiral that the Bank of England had to step in, the tax cuts were instantly reversed, and Liz Truss ended up resigning after just 6 weeks in office. That is the devastating, real-time power of the market losing confidence. So, are those same vigilantes currently circling the U.S.? Economists track this anxiety using something called the term premium. That's basically the extra cash investors demand for taking on long-term risks, like sudden inflation or political budget chaos. Well, in January of this year, the U.S. term premium hit its highest level in over a decade. It is flashing a major warning sign of deep uncertainty. In fact, massive wealth managers like PIMCO, who oversee a mind-boggling $2 trillion, have started cutting their exposure to long-dated U.S. debt. They aren't abandoning the U.S. entirely, but they are absolutely diversifying because they see the deficit dynamics steadily getting worse. Let's move to Section 3, economic ripples and what this means for the great budget squeeze. Just let this number sink in for a second. Nearly $1 trillion. Thanks to this brutal combo of soaring overall debt plus those higher interest rates demanded by the bond vigilantes we just talked about, the U.S. is expected to spend almost $1 trillion purely on interest payments this year. That is just the cost to maintain the debt, and it completely evaporates 18% of the country's total tax revenue right off the top. And here is where you really feel the squeeze. By 2025, the Congressional Budget Office expects our net interest costs to totally eclipse our spending on Medicare, to eclipse our spending on Medicaid, and even to surpass everything we spend on national defense. When the interest piece of the pie grows that aggressively, it violently squeezes out everything else. Whether your priority is tax cuts or more defense spending or better social programs, it doesn't matter because the money simply isn't there anymore. And you know who really gets the short end of the stick here? Younger generations. As economic creator Kyla Scanlon points out, young people are staring down a brutal double-edged sword. They're inheriting an economy where massive debt actively slows down growth. They face the very real risk of losing access to services like Social Security and Medicaid when they finally retire. But they are stuck footing the massive tax bill today to pay for the benefits the previous generations already enjoyed. On top of all that, because we're completely maxing out the national credit card right now, we are losing our emergency buffer for the inevitable crises of tomorrow.
All right, Section 4, Global Impact. Let's look at how this ties directly into national security and foreign leverage.
Here is another staggering, almost unbelievable number: $93 billion. This year, the United States will spend $93 billion more on its debt interest payments than it will on its entire national defense budget. We actually crossed that terrifying threshold last year, and let me tell you, it is ringing major alarm bells for military strategists everywhere. And it is absolutely crucial to understand who actually owns all this debt. It's not just domestic. Foreign nations hold massive amounts of U.S. treasuries. Japan holds over $1 trillion, and China holds roughly $800 billion. How does that even happen? Well, it's basically a trade mechanism. Let's say a Japanese automaker sells a car to a U.S. consumer for 30 grand. That cash eventually goes to a Japanese bank to be converted into yen so they can pay their local factory workers. The Japanese bank then takes those U.S. dollars and reinvests them into U.S. treasuries, simply because they're seen as a super safe, easily tradable asset. But this creates what historian Niall Ferguson calls a geopolitical game of chicken. We are squeezing our own domestic defense spending just to pay the interest, while simultaneously relying heavily on foreign creditors, some of whom are strategic rivals, to keep buying our debt. This is a massive, glaring vulnerability for a global superpower. Do you think adversaries like Russia and China look at our debt levels and see a weakness they could exploit? Absolutely. While a massive, sudden dump of U.S. treasuries by a foreign power would financially hurt them too, just the theoretical leverage it creates is a very serious national security threat. And that brings us to our final stop, Section 5, the real threat: political division. I want to pose a really provocative question to you. Is the national debt our biggest national security threat? Well, back in 2010, Admiral Michael Mullen, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff under both George W. Bush and Barack Obama, actually shocked the press corps when he answered yes to this exact question. He looked past nuclear missiles, he looked past foreign armies, and he pointed directly at the U.S. balance sheet. But recently, Admiral Mullen was asked that exact same question again. And his answer evolved into a pretty shocking twist. This time he said, "My answer is no. I actually think the political division in the country has risen to our biggest threat." You see, the true danger isn't just the math of the debt, it's the deeply polarized partisan politics that are completely preventing us from fixing it. Lawmakers on both sides favor the easy, politically popular choices. One side loves cutting taxes, the other side loves growing spending. Both of those options win elections, but both of them make the debt spiral spin even faster.
And that leaves us with one final inescapable truth: the absolute necessity of bipartisan compromise. Reversing this fiscal nightmare is going to require leaders from both sides of the aisle to step up, look at the math impartially, and make some really hard sacrifices. They have to agree to compromise. But with political division growing wider and more bitter every single day, that task becomes exponentially harder, leaving our financial future and the future of the next generation hanging precariously in the balance. So I'll leave you with this. How long do you think we can walk the invisible dog fence before we finally cross the line?